Good evening, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the quiet corner of the internet where the past stretches out like a well-worn path beneath the stars. A place where you can let your mind settle gently into the rhythms of long-forgotten ages. Tonight, we invite you to journey with us slowly, softly, into the humid forests of West Africa, where gold glinted underfoot, where the beat of drums could carry for miles, and where a proud kingdom once stood tall against one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. This is the story of the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, a drawn-out conflict that spanned over 100 years, one that saw no quick victories, no single dramatic turning point, but rather a slow, creaking struggle of politics, pride, diplomacy, and misunderstanding. A war, or rather a series of wars, that began not with cannon fire, but with trade. That escalated not from hatred, but from a failure to understand. So, settle in. Perhaps you're already wrapped in a blanket, your pillow cool beneath your cheek. Maybe you're listening late at night, or drifting off with the morning light. And if you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're watching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night or drifting off with the morning light. Let's begin. At the very beginning, imagine yourself standing beneath the broad green canopy of an endless forest. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth. The soft rustle of leaves overhead blends with the faraway murmur of voices. The light is diffused, dappled, gentle filtering through layers of vines and branches. This is the Ashanti Kingdom in the late 1700s, and this is Kumasi. Kumasi, the beating heart of the Ashanti realm, was unlike anything the British had seen when they first heard whispers of it. Hidden deep inland, it was not built for the eye of a European visitor, and yet it throbbed with wealth, organization, and spiritual rhythm. Houses were built from rich red clay, with polished floors and intricate designs. Markets buzzed, but not chaotically. They moved to a rhythm. Gold dust passed hands, cowries were counted, cloths were unfurled and refolded. Everything had its place. Everything had its pace. The Ashanti people were not hurried. Their lives followed a cadence shaped by tradition and ritual. At the center of it all was the Asani, not just a king, but a sacred presence. His authority was not loud. It was absolute, and it moved with quiet inevitability. The golden stool never sat upon symbolized the very soul of the Ashanti people. To defile it, even to touch it without the right, was unthinkable. It represented continuity, memory, the weight of ancestors, and those ancestors were never far. Spirits lived among the people, in the forests, in carved stools, in the words passed from elder to child. The Ashanti didn't separate the sacred from the daily. The drumbeat of religion, governance, and kinship was one and the same. Men worked the land with iron tools, cultivating yams, maize, and plantain. Women ran market stalls, balanced goods upon their heads, and maintained the social spine of the household. Gold was not rare. It shimmered in riverbeds and adorned the wrists and necks of rulers and traders. Ashanti military organization was impressive, quietly so. Companies were divided with precision. Drummers signaled commands. The forest was not a barrier. It was their shield, their ally. Movement through it required not brute force, but knowledge passed down over generations. And in this kingdom, law was administered not with cruelty, but with careful balance. Elders deliberated. The voice of the community was heeded. Punishment was real, but it was considered. Reconciliation mattered. Kumasi was not perfect. Like all empires, it demanded tribute. It had enemies. It expanded and absorbed, but its core was stable, steady. The rhythm of its life, for over a century, had continued almost uninterrupted until the coastal winds began to shift. Far to the south, past the thickest jungles, the Atlantic lapped quietly at the Gold Coast. There, European forts rose like stone islands, each a foothold for trade, for influence, and eventually for control. And among these Europeans, one empire would soon turn its attention inland, the British. But for now, imagine once more the quiet streets of Kumasi, the clay courtyards washed clean by afternoon rains, the incense curling upward in the royal compound, the muffled chant of a priest calling upon spirits known only to the Ashanti, the steady pulse of a world not yet shaken. The forest breathes, the people move with it, and history waits, just beyond the trees. The forest opens slowly to the sea. As the 18th century melted into the 19th, the southern edge of the Ashanti sphere, the long and shifting coastline known to Europeans as the Gold Coast, was no longer just a border. It had become a membrane, soft and porous, through which new ideas, goods, and pressures seeped steadily inward. At first, the relationship between the Ashanti and the coast was indirect. They did not, themselves, build forts or launch ships. Instead, they established links through intermediary states, particularly the Fant Confederacy. These coastal allies, and sometimes rivals, handled the actual exchange with European traders. And in this quiet arrangement, the Ashanti found profit and distance. But the winds began to shift. By the early 1800s, the presence of Europeans on the coast Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, and most persistently, British had hardened from occasional trade visits to permanent stone fortresses. Fort Amsterdam, Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle, these were not simply trading posts, but enclaves of European influence, slowly rooting themselves into the very soil of the land. Imagine them, low, thick-walled structures surrounded by flags that fluttered in the warm Atlantic wind. Inside, quiet ledgers were filled with numbers. Casks were rolled across worn stone floors. Bells rang, not for prayer, but for the marking of ships' arrivals and cargo ledgers. For the Europeans, the coast was the edge of opportunity. For the Fant, it was a stage of negotiation and survival. For the Ashanti, it was growing ever closer. The Fant and Ashanti had long held a complex relationship. The Ashanti, wealthier and militarily stronger, viewed the coast as within their economic sphere. The Fant, fiercely independent and acutely aware of their geographical advantage, resisted overt control. This delicate balance was maintained, at first, by mutual benefit. The Ashanti needed access to the Atlantic for trade, especially for firearms, cloth, and imported goods that made their way into the forests. The Fant profited from this arrangement as middlemen, extracting tariffs and influence. But tensions simmered. The Ashanti, strong inland, found themselves frustrated by their lack of direct access. The Fant, watching British influence grow, saw an opportunity for leverage. In time, they would forge tighter ties with the British, a decision, or not of loyalty, but of caution. The British, for their part, viewed both the Fant and Ashanti with a certain colonial detachment, an underestimation rooted in distance, language, and cultural blindness. To them, the Ashanti were an inland curiosity. Impressive, perhaps, but remote. The Fant were more convenient, more accessible, and more easily influenced. Still, the Ashanti presence loomed. By the turn of the 19th century, their power was no longer a distant whisper. It was a reality felt all along the Gold Coast. The Ashanti could move armies through the forest. They could impose tribute. They could shut down trade routes. Imagine now a British trader standing at the ramparts of Cape Coast Castle. The horizon stretches endlessly out to sea, but it is inland that his gaze often drifts, toward the dense line of trees, where no wind moves the leaves, and where Ashanti messengers sometimes emerge, bearing gold or threats or both. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished by the British Parliament. Officially, this marked a humanitarian turning point. But economically, it disrupted long-standing patterns. The Ashanti had profited from slave exports via the coast. Now their trade terms would need to shift. Gold became more central, but so did palm oil, ivory, and cola nuts. The Atlantic economy was reshaping itself, and the Ashanti, despite being inland, were forced to adapt. Tensions over tariffs, access, and control increased. Ashanti leaders, recognizing the growing significance of direct negotiation, began sending envoys to British forts. These were formal visits, regal, slow-moving processions. Messengers bore gifts: ivory tusks, gold dust sealed in leather pouches, woven cloths of breathtaking intricacy. The British, accustomed to dealing with coastal chiefs, were often unsure how to interpret these envoys. Were they emissaries of equals? Petitioners? Threats? Miscommunication crept in. One side followed ancient forms of diplomacy, built upon protocol, silence, and metaphor. The other relied on blunt negotiation, legal frameworks, and written correspondence. And yet, for a time, peace held. There were moments, brief, flickering moments of true understanding. Ashanti envoys were invited to observe British military drills. British officials attended ceremonies in Kumasi. Gifts were exchanged. Letters, though stiff and oddly phrased, were traded. Still, the foundations were shifting. Imagine a coastal breeze, salt-heavy and persistent, blowing through the open shutters of a British trading post. Papers flutter slightly. A map lies upon a table, drawn with lines that do not quite match the realities on the ground. That breeze carries with it the faint scent of wood smoke and tension. The Ashanti knew their interests were being tested, their authority challenged. And deep in Kumasi, under the gold-tipped eaves of the palace, the Asanahin's council met more frequently. The forests, once a quiet buffer, were becoming a highway of rumor, goods, and growing confrontation. Still, there was no war. Yet, only the long hush before it. The forest does not give way easily. To those unused to its embrace, the Ashanti hinterland was a place of perpetual dusk-green shadowed paths and narrow, winding trails where sunlight filtered through high branches, but never fully reached the ground. It smelled of rich humus, damp bark, and the faint musk of unseen creatures. It muffled sound. It disoriented the senses. For the British, this was not only a geographic journey, but a cultural one. To move inland was to step into an entirely different rhythm of life, one measured not by clocks, but by the call of birds, the turn of seasons, and the slow cadence of royal ceremony. Their first real incursions into Ashanti territory were tentative, exploratory, uncertain. Early on, British officials at the coast had preferred to deal through intermediaries, fant leaders, coastal brokers, and contracted messengers. But as tension grew and Ashanti influence became impossible to ignore, the need to go inland to meet the Ashanti on their own ground became unavoidable. And so they went. Imagine now a British envoy, mounted on horseback, though most of the journey must be made on foot. He wears a linen shirt, already damp with sweat, and carries documents tied in oilskin. Around him, carriers move in slow, practiced silence. They know the path. They do not speak unless spoken to. Their footsteps are light. The forest watches. It took days to reach Kumasi. The city did not rise in dramatic towers, but unfolded gradually, its courtyards, streets, and compounds revealing themselves like rooms in a grand estate, shaded and humming with life. To the British, it was bewildering and oddly magnificent. The royal palace of the Asanahin was not a single building, but a sprawling network of structures, pillared halls, open spaces for council meetings, shrines, storerooms, and living quarters. Each carefully maintained. The floors were swept daily. The walls painted in red ochre and white lime. Carvings adorned doorways, scenes of myth, authority, and ancestral power. And at the center, the king. The Asanihin did not leap to greet visitors. He did not shout nor hurry. He arrived in measured silence, accompanied by drums whose beats echoed like distant thunder. His voice was low, his words few, but his presence was unmistakable. The British struggled to interpret what they saw. They came expecting informality, perhaps even chaos. They found instead a society of deep, formal order. But they also misunderstood much of it. British observers, trained in European ideas of sovereignty and statehood, could not always see the internal logic of the Ashanti system. They mistook ritual for weakness. They confused deference with submission. They assumed that the silence of Ashanti emissaries meant passivity, when in truth, it often meant judgment. This early phase of interaction tense, uncertain, was not war, but it was the quiet prelude to it. Some meetings went well. Ashanti leaders offered gifts, assured continued trade, and expressed a desire for partnership. But they also made clear their expectations. Tribute from the Fant, control over inland trade, and recognition of Ashanti supremacy in the region. The British, hearing these demands, balked. They were not yet prepared for a confrontation, but neither were they willing to recognize the Ashanti as equals. Imagine, if you will, two officials, one British, seated uncomfortably on a carved stool, fidgeting slightly under the heat, and one Ashanti, silent, calm, hands folded, waiting. A silence stretches between them. Outside, the cicadas drone in rhythmic waves. Inside, the air is still. The British envoy shifts. He pulls out a document, speaks of agreements and alliances. The Ashanti man listens. He nods, slowly, but his face reveals nothing. Later, that same British officer writes a report. He describes the Ashanti as reserved, possibly unfriendly. But what he does not understand is that he has been judged and found lacking not out of hostility, but caution. For the Ashanti, the British are not yet trustworthy. They are new, inconsistent, and unpredictable. Still, there is no war. Yet, instead, there are visits, letters, gifts, misunderstandings. There is a particular moment, a small moment, noted in a quiet journal, when a British officer observed an Ashanti ritual involving libation. Wine, or perhaps a local brew, was poured upon the ground as a prayer. The officer thought it wasteful, but what he missed was its meaning: to honor the ancestors, to remind those present that all agreements must pass not only through the hands of the living, but through the memory of the dead. For the Ashanti, this was not superstition. It was governance. And slowly, the British would learn, though often too late, that their path into the interior was not merely a march across terrain, but a passage through meanings they did not yet understand. Back at the coast, in the whitewashed halls of Cape Coast Castle, decisions were made. Reports from inland were confusing. Some called the Ashanti cooperative. Others warned of brewing threat. Some envoys described the richness of Kumasi with admiration. Others returned with tales of arrogance and tension. And among the Fant, frustration grew. They watched as their former role as intermediaries weakened. Ashanti power extended further. British attention wavered. In 1823, a single event would change this balance. A British officer, Sir Charles McCarthy, would be drawn into a confrontation with Ashanti forces. He believed he could manage it. He could not. But that is the next part of our story. For now, let us return one more time to the quiet path through the forest, the sound of sandals on worn earth, the low rhythm of a talking drum in the distance, and the weight of expectation thick in the warm air. The British had arrived inland. The Ashanti were watching, and the forest remained still. The quiet did not last. It rarely does when misunderstanding is left to simmer. The first Anglo-Ashanti War began not with a great declaration or a public clash of armies, but with confidence, miscalculation, and the quiet unraveling of assumptions. It was 1823. The Ashanti Empire, proud and internally confident, had grown increasingly firm in its assertion that the southern coastal lands, particularly those inhabited by the Fantai, lay within their sphere of influence. Tribute had long been expected from these areas. Control over trade was, in their eyes, a right. But the Fant resisted, and the British, nestled along the coast in their forts, had taken increasing steps to support Fant independence. Whether out of strategy, commerce, or mere proximity, the result was the same. The Ashanti saw it as a betrayal. For years, tensions had quietly escalated. Envoys came and went. Reports were written. Gold exchanged hands. But the foundation had begun to crack. Into this tense landscape stepped Sir Charles McCarthy, the new governor of the British Gold Coast settlements. He was a man of strong convictions and confident ideals, but his understanding of Ashanti power was limited. McCarthy believed that a show of force, a firm hand, could settle the matter. He underestimated the Ashanti, fatally. In late 1823, he led a small column of soldiers inland, intending to confront the Ashanti near the River Pra. He believed his force sufficient. Reinforcements were expected. The terrain was believed manageable. But the forest had its own rules. The Ashanti were already there, watching. Their troops moved with silent coordination. They knew the paths. They used the forest as a veil. And when they struck near a place called Nsemenko, it was swift and overwhelming. McCarthy's column was scattered. He himself was killed in the chaos. It is said that his skull was later fashioned into a drinking cup by the Ashanti, though some suggest this tale was more British myth than fact, a symbol of humiliation dressed in exotic horror. Regardless, the defeat was total. British prestige along the coast was shaken. The Ashanti had proven they were no minor power, no coastal tribe to be brushed aside. They had organization, numbers, resolve, but victory did not bring peace. The war that followed was slow, fragmented. There were no great battles, no sweeping campaigns. Instead, there were forays and retreats. Forts exchanged hands. Coastal allies rose and fell. The forest swallowed movement. The rain disrupted plans. Ashanti forces pushed south, at times threatening coastal forts. British soldiers struggled with illness malaria, and dysentery stalked their camps more effectively than any enemy. Supplies ran short. Communication broke down. At one point, British officials feared Kumasi itself might descend upon the coast. But it did not. The Ashanti, while militarily capable, had no desire to overrun the British entirely. Their war was defensive. Assertive, yes, but bounded by clear goals. To reassert their control, to safeguard their trade, to defend their sovereignty. The British, on the other hand, faced confusion. They could not maintain a steady force inland. Their understanding of terrain and politics remained shallow. And coastal allies like the Fant proved unreliable, balancing their fear of the Ashanti against skepticism toward British motives. After several years of inconclusive engagements, a treaty was negotiated in 1831. It was not a resounding peace, nor was it an acknowledgement of defeat. Rather, it was a mutual pause, a weary recognition that neither side had gained what they wanted. The British retained their forts along the coast. The Ashanti maintained their dominance inland. Trade resumed, though nervously, and an uneasy quiet returned to the forests. But the war had left echoes. In Kumasi, there was pride, but also caution. The Ashanti knew the British would return. The defeat of McCarthy had not destroyed the empire, it had awoken it. In Cape Coast Castle, officials reviewed their strategies. Reports were rewritten. Maps were redrawn. And though no further action was taken for some time, the idea of inland intervention remained quietly active. Imagine now a document yellowed, handwritten, its ink faded with time. It records the Memorandum of Understanding, between British envoys and Ashanti nobles. It speaks in the stiff tones of diplomacy, but between the lines, one can sense the weariness of both sides. The war had taken lives, not in sweeping drama, but in slow, grinding attrition. Disease, exhaustion, disillusionment. And it had changed perceptions. The British now knew the Ashanti were not to be taken lightly. The Ashanti now knew the British were not easily dislodged. And so the peace held, for a time. Through the 1830s and 1840s, both powers withdrew slightly. The British focused on the coast. The Ashanti turned inward, managing internal affairs, reasserting control, repairing alliances. There were still tensions, still incidents, but no full war. Not yet. This first conflict spanning from 1823 to 1831 would, in time, be remembered as the beginning of a longer struggle. A century of fits and starts, of invasion and retreat, of misunderstanding layered upon misunderstanding. And even in the quiet aftermath, the drums still beat in Kumasi, not of war, not of mourning, but of rhythm, of continuity. The Ashanti endured. The forest, once more, grew quiet. The war had passed. The treaties were signed. But peace, like the forest canopy overhead, was more shadow than substance. In the years that followed the First Anglo-Ashanti War, the Gold Coast did not return to calm, not completely. The air still held the quiet tension of things unresolved, like the scent of rain in the distance, long before a storm. The Ashanti Empire withdrew, but did not retreat. Their armies returned to Kumasi. Their roads, lined with palms and clay markers, once again bore the slow movement of traders, messengers, and tax collectors. The capital city resumed its rhythm. The drums still beat. The sacred stools were still polished with care. And yet, something had shifted. To the south, along the humid Atlantic coast, British forts stood still stone and whitewashed, gazing out over the surf. But within, their occupants moved differently now. They wrote more cautiously. Their patrols were better organized. Their tone in letters to London had changed. McCarthy's death had left a scar, and in its wake, the Crown had begun to question the logic of leaving such matters to local administrators and trading companies. The British presence on the Gold Coast, once primarily commercial, began to take on a more political shape. The African Company of Merchants, who had long managed British interests in the region, was quietly dismantled in 1821. The Crown assumed direct control over the forts, a symbolic shift that marked a deeper change in intention. This was no longer just a matter of trade. It was now a matter of policy, of empire. And policy, like war, often moves in increments. The coast was becoming more complex. Between the Ashanti hinterland and the British stone walls lay a patchwork of smaller states, Fant, Denkira, Wassa, and others, each with their own histories, ambitions, and survival instincts. These middle kingdoms, caught between two powers, played a delicate game. To the British, the Fant were sometimes framed as allies buffer states who could be relied upon. But the truth was more tangled. The Fant Confederacy had its own reasons for resisting Ashanti influence, and its own frustrations with British arrogance. One moment, they welcomed British presence. The next, they questioned it. Agreements were made and broken. Forts requested, then refused. Tribute offered, then denied. To the Ashanti, these coastal tribes were former subjects, or at least tributaries, whose rejection of authority was both an affront and a threat. But to crush them outright would mean pushing deeper into British-held zones. And that path had already proven costly. Imagine a map laid out across a polished wooden desk in Cape Coast Castle. Small ink circles for Fort Cape Coast, Anamabu, Fort William. Inland, broader swaths labeled vaguely, Ashanti territory. Rivers, mountains, and forest are marked, but always imprecisely. And in the margins, notes, uncertain allegiance. Chief reports favorable, trade route vulnerable. This was the nature of the Gold Coast in the mid-19th century, place of shifting alliances and careful balancing acts. To navigate it, both the Ashanti and the British needed more than armies. They needed understanding. And that, as ever, was in short supply. In Kumasi, the Ashanti focused inward during the 1830s and 40s. The Asanahin of the time, Kwaku Dua I, was a ruler known for prudence and ritual strength. He held court in shaded courtyards, heard petitions beneath cloth canopies, and maintained a firm grip over regional chiefs. He avoided conflict with the British, but he did not forget them. Envoys were still sent, letters too, but with every year that passed, the gap between the two cultures grew more difficult to bridge. To the British, Ashanti behavior seemed haughty, rigid, overly ceremonial. To the Ashanti, British demands were blunt, disrespectful, and dangerously presumptuous. And all the while, the coastal structure was changing. In 1850, the British purchased all Danish possessions on the Gold Coast, including Fort Christiansborg, near present-day Accra. This further consolidated their influence and signaled, in quiet but unmistakable terms, that Britain intended to stay. Trade, too, was changing. With the end of the transatlantic slave trade, new commodities rose in importance, palm oil in particular. British industrial expansion back home had created a hunger for lubricants for machines, and the Gold Coast's palm-rich interior became a resource of quiet value. But the Ashanti controlled many of the inland routes through which palm oil passed. Their control was rarely complete, but always felt. British merchants operating from the coast found themselves paying tariffs to Ashanti officials. Convoys were stopped. Gold dust changed hands. And with every payment, the irritation grew. Letters to London described the Ashanti as obstructive, ambitious, unstable. But in truth, they were simply maintaining sovereignty over what they saw as their rightful territory. Tensions simmered. In 1853, British authorities established a formal legislative council in Cape Coast, a further step toward colonial governance. Meanwhile, Ashanti leaders looked on with a wary eye, noting the increasing presence of missionaries, settlers, and soldiers along the coast. One incident in 1859, minor but telling, involved a dispute over a convoy of trade goods heading from Kumasi toward the coast. British authorities claimed the Ashanti were interfering unjustly. The Ashanti countered that the convoy had violated agreed trade customs. There was no battle, no formal confrontation, but messages were exchanged. Warnings delivered. Drums beat in Kumasi once more, not for war, but for vigilance. The British forts, outwardly serene, began to strengthen their internal defenses, and the forest listened. Through all of this, the people in between, the farmers, the traders, the carriers of goods along the narrow footpaths, continued their work. They moved steadily between the zones of influence, speaking multiple languages, carrying knowledge from place to place. They were not warriors, but they bore witness to a slow-motion standoff, and in their footsteps, history waited. By the early 1860s, it was clear the peace of the past 3 decades was growing brittle. A new war would not begin with shouts or cannon fire, but it would come all the same. The Second Anglo-Ashanti War was near. The forest was restless again. It was 1863. 30 years had passed since the First Anglo-Ashanti War. In that time, both the Ashanti Empire and the British presence along the Gold Coast had evolved quietly, slowly, and in ways not always visible to the eye. The years had added layers of protocol, of shifting trade routes and revised treaties. But under the surface, old tensions had merely settled like dust not gone, just waiting for a stir. And then, almost imperceptibly, they stirred. The Second Anglo-Ashanti War is in some ways a curious conflict. Not because of what it accomplished, indeed, Its results were vague and inconclusive, but because of how quietly it began and how softly it faded, there were no grand declarations, no decisive battles. Instead, there was misunderstanding, mistrust, missteps. It began with a murder. A man from the Ashanti Protectorate of Asin, an area under disputed authority between the Ashanti and the coastal British presence, was killed. The circumstances remain uncertain. British authorities believe the Ashanti were responsible. The Ashanti denied any wrongdoing and claimed the matter should be resolved through established custom. But the British disagreed. In Accra, where the British had moved much of their administrative power after acquiring Danish holdings, the response was swift. Troops were readied, envoys recalled. Letters were dispatched to Kumasi with demands that, while formal in tone, left little room for interpretation. The Ashanti, perceiving the sudden aggression as a violation of long-standing diplomatic channels, were offended. Their response was firm, but not inflammatory. They proposed dialogue. They emphasized restraint. But restraint, in times of heightened tension, can be mistaken for evasion. In 1863, British forces began to march northward into the forest. Imagine them, rows of soldiers in heavy uniforms, their boots ill-suited to the damp forest floor, the sound of their movements swallowed by the canopy. The forest watched them, indifferent and unmoved. Rain fell. Often, the narrow paths turned to slow rivers of mud. Supply chains faltered. Mosquitoes gathered in the humid air. Food spoiled. Morale sagged. There were no great engagements. Instead, there was attrition of spirit, of strength, of purpose. The Ashanti, who knew the terrain intimately, refused to engage the British directly. Their troops moved quietly, always at a distance. They intercepted supply lines, harried flanks, and then vanished. They used the forest not as a backdrop, but as a shield, a weapon, an ally. British soldiers, many of them recently arrived from colder climates, began to fall ill. Malaria swept through the columns. Fevers rose. Camps, intended to be temporary outposts, became infirmaries. By mid-1864, the expedition had lost momentum entirely. The British had advanced only a short distance into Ashanti territory. Kumasi was never reached. There were no dramatic victories, only exhaustion. And so, the decision was quietly made to withdraw. There was no treaty, no ceremony, just retreat. Back down the same muddy paths, back to the coast, back to the forts and administrative halls, and awaiting correspondence. In Kumasi, the drums did not beat in celebration. The Ashanti had not pursued the British. They had not sought to destroy them. They had merely endured. To the Ashanti court, this war reaffirmed what they had long believed, that their strength came not from aggressive conquest, but from rootedness, from knowing the land, from patience. But even they knew the situation was changing. The British had not been decisively defeated. They had simply hesitated. And hesitation, in the context of empire, is rarely permanent. Imagine now the quiet of an abandoned camp, empty tents, scattered crates, rain tapping gently on canvas left behind. The signs of a campaign not completed, but surrendered to weather and terrain. British officers returned to Accra with little to report. Some wrote that the campaign had been poorly planned. Others blamed sickness. A few criticized Ashanti treachery, though the war itself had barely witnessed any direct fighting. Back in London, the war was barely noticed. It had cost money, yes, and lives lost to fever. But it had not altered British control along the coast, and so it passed quickly from the minds of imperial administrators. But in Ghana, the memory lingered. Among the Ashanti, the Second War was not considered a war of victory or defeat. It was a reaffirmation, a lesson in the limits of British ambition, and a reminder of the empire's resilience. Yet even as the Ashanti celebrated their endurance, change was creeping forward. Just 3 years later, in 1867, Britain and the Netherlands agreed to exchange forts along the Gold Coast, consolidating British control even further. By 1872, the Dutch ceded all the remaining holdings to Britain. For the Ashanti, this was alarming. Where once there had been multiple European powers to negotiate with each balancing the other, there was now only one, the British. And they were no longer merely traders. They were governors. And governors, unlike merchants, carry the ambitions of empire. In 1874, they would return. This time with a different kind of force, and the forest would not be enough to stop them. The air along the Gold Coast had changed. Gone was the uneven patchwork of European forts, each flying a different flag, each negotiating its own trade routes, its own fragile arrangements. By the early 1870s, a single banner now fluttered in the ocean breeze, the Union Jack. The Dutch, after centuries of coastal trade and shifting treaties, had withdrawn entirely in 1872. Their final gesture was to sell their forts, including the ancient stronghold of Elmina, to the British. And though the transaction was conducted through letters and signatures, wax seals and ceremonial handovers, the implications stretched deep into the forested interior. To the Ashanti, Elmina had long held particular meaning. Though once a Portuguese outpost, it had become part of their diplomatic landscape, a channel through which they could negotiate, not only with the Dutch, but through the complex relationships of the Fant and other coastal allies. It was a hinge point, a tool of balance. Now that tool was gone. Britain stood alone on the coast. Imagine for a moment the scene in Elmina on the day of transfer. Dutch officials packing their ledgers, taking down portraits, folding away flags. British officers stepping in, quiet but firm, their boots echoing in familiar stone corridors. Outside, the people of Elmina watch, some curious, others uneasy, still others uncertain. The Ashanti watched too. Messengers were dispatched from Kumasi. The Asanahin at the time, Kofi Karakari, understood the significance of this consolidation. No longer could the Ashanti negotiate along multiple fronts. The avenues of diplomacy were narrowing. Their world-long custom to playing external powers against one another had shifted, and what replaced it was harder, colder, more absolute. The British Crown had assumed not only administrative authority over the coastal forts, but also the right to govern the surrounding territories. They began organizing new civil structures, new codes of conduct, and new economic arrangements. The language changed. Trade was now regulation. Allies were now subjects. Agreements were now policy. For the Ashanti, these changes were not merely external adjustments. They threatened the internal equilibrium of the empire itself. Tribute from southern tribes began to falter. Coastal access was increasingly restricted. Caravans returning from the sea brought back not just goods, but rumors of taxes, of land seizures, of missionaries who built schools and churches and spoke of a single god who frowned upon ancestral spirits. The Ashanti court listened carefully. They were not a society averse to change. On the contrary, they had long adopting firearms, modifying trade systems, engaging in complex diplomacy with foreign powers. But this was different. The British were no longer content to remain at the edge of the forest. They were stepping into it. In 1873, the situation escalated when an Ashanti force advanced toward the coast ostensibly to reassert control over rebellious territories. The British, interpreting this as an outright threat, responded with preparations for a full-scale invasion. This was no longer a war of traders. It was a campaign of empire. In London, Parliament debated the costs. British newspapers reported the Ashanti as an obstacle to civilization, a menace to British subjects. The language grew sharper, more self-assured. The logic of colonization crept into public discourse. not as ambition, but as burden, as duty. Back on the Gold Coast, British officials began organizing. Troops were summoned from far beyond the region: soldiers from Britain, sailors from the West Indies, engineers, porters. Supplies arrived in crates, stamped and counted. Maps were drawn, adjusted, redrawn again. And in Kumasi, the Council of Chiefs met under the shadowed eaves of the palace. Kofi Karakari listened. Advisors spoke in deliberate tones. The air was heavy, not only with the scent of oil lamps and forest damp, but with the knowledge that this conflict would not resemble the ones that came before. This would not be another border skirmish. This would be a march. And so preparations began. The golden stool remained untouched, enshrined and hidden from foreign eyes, but warriors were summoned. Drums signaled commands. Black powder was prepared. Lines of communication were laid. The forest, once a wall of safety, would now become a battlefield. Still, some in Kumasi hoped for negotiation, a final chance. Envoys were sent, but the letters from the British were clear. The Ashanti were to abandon all claims over the southern territories. They were to recognize British authority over the Gold Coast and submit to regulation. There was no middle ground. And so, in late 1873, the British Crown officially launched a punitive expedition led by Sir Garnet Wolseley, a man of method and reputation. He would march on Kumasi, not to bargain, but to subdue. And the forest would once more hear the sound of boots, cannons, and the low groan of supply carts rolling over damp, uneven earth. In this moment, the world had changed. The British were no longer merely guests on the coast. They were now an empire in full motion, extending tendrils inland, not with curiosity, but with certainty. And the Ashanti would meet them not with surrender, but with silence and preparation. The bond between the British and the Ashanti had never been one of friendship, not in the way the word is often understood. It had been a tether of necessity, of commerce, of parallel ambitions held at a respectful distance. There had been moments of calm, even of cooperation. But beneath it all, a slow tension always pulsed like a fault line hidden beneath a calm sea. By the early 1870s, that tension had begun to rise again. The British, now consolidated as the sole European authority on the coast, governed not only through forts and garrisons, but through councils, codes, and proclamations. They no longer viewed the Ashanti as a regional power to be negotiated with. They viewed them as a complication one to be removed or brought to heel. And the Ashanti knew this. In Kumasi, the court of the Asanahin continued to deliberate. The rhythms of royal life moved steadily. Ceremonial drummers rehearsed their patterns. Courtiers approached the palace with matters of dispute and tribute, but there was a note of unease beneath the surface. The British were speaking more firmly now. Their letters, though polite, had sharpened in tone. Their expectations were clearer. And among the southern tribes, many of whom had once paid tribute to the Ashanti, British influence was growing. These coastal kingdoms had, over time, grown weary of Ashanti power. For decades, they had existed in an uncomfortable middle place, bound by traditional obligations to Kumasi, but increasingly tempted by British promises of protection, trade access, and most importantly, autonomy. The British played this position carefully. They began appointing local rulers, establishing protectorate agreements, building new outposts inland. Each action, while not explicitly aggressive, was a small erosion of Ashanti influence. Each declaration, a quiet challenge. And in 1872, when Elmina was transferred from Dutch to British control, the final thread of Ashanti diplomacy on the coast snapped. The Ashanti believed they had a claim rooted in history, alliance, and inheritance to oversee the area around Elmina. The people there had long been tied to Kumasi through tribute and exchange. But with the Dutch gone, that claim meant little to the British. Tensions flared quickly. Ashanti envoys visited the coast. Their language was firm, but not threatening. They reminded British officials of prior agreements, of boundaries respected. The British listened, but they did not concede. And so the Ashanti began to move. It was not a grand invasion. It was not even a formal declaration of war. Rather, it was a gesture. A military column was sent south, not to attack, but to demonstrate presence, authority, to remind all watching coastal tribes, British administrators, and traders that the Ashanti Empire had not vanished into the forest. But for the British, it was unacceptable. The presence of armed Ashanti forces, so near to British installations, was viewed as provocation. Officials reported the movement with alarm. Rumors bloomed exaggerated, perhaps, but influential. There was talk of an imminent siege, of Kumasi plotting war. London responded with urgency. In dispatches to the colonial office, the tone shifted. What had once been regional management was now cast in the language of imperial defense. The Ashanti were labeled not as an equal power, but as a threat to British peacekeeping. Their refusal to acknowledge the full extent of British authority on the coast was deemed rebellion. Rebellion required a response. The idea of war-long simmering in the background took shape. In 1873, Sir Garnick Wolseley was appointed to lead a British military expedition into Ashanti territory. His orders were precise. He was to march to Kumasi. He was to defeat the Ashanti. He was to establish, once and for all, the primacy of British authority in West Africa. In Kumasi, the Ashanti Council prepared once more. Kofi Karakari remained cautious. He had no desire to provoke open conflict, but he also would not bow. Messages were sent, not of defiance, but of disappointment. The British had misunderstood their intentions. They had escalated what might have been settled through diplomacy. Still, the drums beat again. Warriors gathered beneath the trees. Black powder was readied. Forest paths were watched with quiet vigilance. But something was different this time. The Ashanti knew the British had changed. This was no longer a war fought from coastal forts. No longer a defense against a limited expedition. This was a campaign. One backed by London, fueled by empire, supported by ships, artillery, and professional regiments. And the forest, though still vast, though still deep, might not be enough. Among the Ashanti, there was no panic, but there was awareness. The court poets and oral historians recorded the mood in their own way through proverbs and parables, passed in the evening light. And among the people market women, traders, porters, there was tension, not loud, not visible, but present. Imagine now the quiet bustle of Kumasi's market. Clay pots line a shaded stall. Smoked fish rests on woven mats. Cowrie shells clink in the hands of a buyer, but voices are hushed. Eyes glance toward the palace. Something is coming. And so, the relationship between the Ashanti and the British unraveled, not through betrayal, not through treachery, but through a gradual hardening, a shifting of expectation, a loss of patience. And once that unraveling began, it could not be stopped. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War would begin soon, and this time it would leave fire behind. The year was 1873. The rainy season had waned, and the forest paths, though still damp, had begun to solidify underfoot. The air remained heavy with moisture. But the drumbeat of war, at last, had resumed. And leading it this time was Sir Garnick Wolseley. Wolseley was not a man of haste, nor of sentiment. He was a British officer molded in the traditions of military discipline and quiet efficiency. He did not shout. He did not bluster. He calculated. He planned. And he had no intention of failing. When he was appointed to lead the British expedition against the Ashanti Empire, it was not as a last resort. It was as a matter of imperial principle. Kumasi would be reached. The Ashanti would be subdued, and the forest, if necessary, would be forced to yield. But the forest, as Wolseley soon learned, does not yield easily. Imagine now the British expedition as it assembled on the coast. Thousands of men, British regulars, colonial troops, engineers, porters, lined up in orderly columns. Crates of ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and equipment were piled high beneath canvas tents. Steamboats moored at the mouth of the River Pra, ready to ferry men and material as far inland as the swollen waters would allow. There was an air of determination and of preparation. This was not the ragged campaign of 1863. This was not the cautious, trade post diplomacy of the 1840s. This was invasion. Wolseley understood what he faced, at least in practical terms. He studied the mistakes of his predecessors, paid close attention to the landscape, and selected a leaner, more mobile force. He knew the forest would resist them, the terrain, the heat, the insects, the rain, but he also knew the Ashanti could no longer be ignored. And so they marched. From Cape Coast Castle, the British expedition began its slow, steady movement into the Ashanti hinterland. At the front were scouts and engineers, clearing paths, repairing bridges, building makeshift roads of palm logs and planks. Behind them came soldiers, their red coats now replaced by more practical khaki. Sweat soaked through their uniforms. Rifles clanked softly against metal fittings. Insects buzzed endlessly. The canopy above blocked the sun, but trapped the heat. The forest closed in around them. And though the Ashanti did not yet appear, the forest itself was adversary enough. Diseases crept through the camp. Malaria took men quickly. Dysentery lingered. Supply lines stretched thin. Porters staggered under heavy loads. Water was filtered through cloth, but always carried the risk of illness. Still, they marched. Every day, a few miles gained. Every night, fires burned low in the damp, flickering light of camp lanterns. And always, the forest watched. The Ashanti did not meet the British in open battle during these early stages. They knew the terrain was their ally. They let the march continue. They slowed it, tested it, but did not stop it. Instead, they prepared. In Kumasi, warriors gathered beneath the sacred trees. Supplies were moved. Ammunition was counted. Messages were sent by drum across great distances, cryptic rhythms echoing from one forest village to the next. The capital, though not fortified in the European sense, became a hive of quiet readiness. For the British, every step northward was costly. Bridges had to be built, trees felled, roads reinforced. The River Pra, wide and slow, was crossed only after weeks of delay, with pontoons and barges assembled from mismatched pieces. Each river crossing was a test of will. Imagine a small unit of British soldiers, knee-deep in swamp water, pushing planks into place. The air hums with mosquitoes. A porter stumbles, nearly dropping a crate of powder. A captain shouts not in anger, but in exasperated fatigue. The forest is not cruel, but it is constant. And in that constancy lies its power. Wolseley wrote in his journal of the unceasing pressure of the bush, the vines, the mud, the ceaseless humidity. Even the silence was oppressive, but he kept marching. In January of 1874, the British reached Emoful 1 of the final defensive lines before Kumasi itself. Here, at last, the Ashanti met them. The Battle of Emoful was fierce. The Ashanti, though outgunned, fought with precision and fury. They used the cover of the trees to deadly effect flanking, retreating, ambushing. British accounts spoke of ghost-like warriors, appearing and vanishing in the mist and foliage. But British firepower artillery and breech-loading rifles carried the day. The Ashanti were forced to withdraw, and the road to Kumasi lay open. Still, Wolseley did not rush. He advanced carefully, Knowing that the Ashanti might regroup, the army moved in stages, occupying villages, re-establishing supply chains, resting their weakened men. The forest began to change. The deeper they moved, the more signs of Ashanti civilization appeared. Rows of cultivated farmland, wooden shrines, paths widened by generations of trade and tribute. The drums grew louder, nearer. And then, one morning, Kumasi appeared, not a city of towers or walls, but of wide streets and low, complex compounds, each painted, patterned, and precise. The palace loomed at its center, golden-roofed and silent. Smoke curled lazily from cooking fires. But the people were gone. The city had been evacuated. The British had marched to Kumasi, but found no enemy waiting. The Ashanti had withdrawn not in fear, but in calculation. They would not allow their sacred city to become a battlefield. And so Wolseley entered Kumasi in silence. The streets echoed with the sounds of boots and hooves. The Union Jack was raised. Drums, confiscated and piled, were silenced. The palace was entered, its shrines untouched, but its authority, for now, claimed. There was no victory parade, only the sigh of a forest, disturbed, and the uneasy quiet of a capital, occupied. The silence in Kumasi was not the silence of defeat. It was something older, something deeper. When the British troops entered the Ashanti capital in early 1874, they found no massed resistance, no hurried barricades or trapped streets. The warriors were gone, the citizens too. What remained was the shell of a kingdom intact, unmoved, but eerily empty. Imagine the soldiers walking through the wide clay avenues, their boots leaving impressions in dust still warm from the morning sun. The city was not ruined. It was waiting. Ashanti houses constructed from red earth, lacquered with oil and soot, silent and steady. Carvings of ancestors watched from lintels. Courtyards lay swept clean. Bowls of yam and palm oil sat abandoned on low tables, as though the inhabitants had only just stepped away. The great palace, seat of the Asanihin's authority, was equally intact. It did not tower like a European castle, but it sprawled wide, low, ordered like a memory laid flat upon the earth. Layers of halls, private rooms, shrines, and council spaces, each imbued with symbolic weight. British officers entered carefully, at first with awe, then with routine. They took inventory. They recorded their findings. They sketched the strange symbols, the golden ornaments, the sacred stools, but they could not truly see. To them, the palace was a structure, a seat of government, a place of interest and conquest. To the Ashanti, it was a spirit in clay and timber. Its walls were layered with oaths, its corners bound with the memory of kings, its altars breathed the words of ancestors. The golden stool was not found. It had been hidden, spirited away by priests and elders before the British arrived. For the Ashanti, it was not a mere object of gold. It was the soul of the nation. Its absence meant that, no matter what was taken, the empire still lived. But the British did not yet understand this. They held the capital. They believed they had broken Ashanti power. They raised the flag. They held councils in the shade of royal porches. And yet, the resistance had simply faded back into the trees. There were no ceremonies of surrender, no handover of authority, only absence. Still, the occupation of Kumasi had its consequences. Wolseley, ever mindful of logistics and appearances, maintained tight order. Looting was discouraged, though it occurred in small, persistent waves. Soldiers worn from the march, exhausted by fever, moved through the city with quiet restlessness. Ashanti shrines were opened, ritual objects examined, documented, sometimes taken. Gold regalia, cuffs, masks, ceremonial swords were seized as trophies. Some would later be displayed in British museums, far from the damp clay of their making. To the British, these were curiosities, testaments to conquest. To the Ashanti, they were wounds. The occupation did not last long. Wolseley had no desire to remain in Kumasi. The forest had taken a toll. The troops were sick, supplies were thinning, and the danger of counterattack, however uncertain, loomed large. And so, plans were made. The capital would be evacuated. But before leaving, Wolseley issued a final command. Kumasi was to be destroyed. Not entirely, but enough to send a message. The palace was torched. Ashanti officials, returning years later, would describe the blackened timbers, the scorched altars, the empty spaces where ancestor shrines had stood for generations. Smoke rose over the treetops, embers caught in the wind. The quiet majesty of Kumasi was reduced to charcoal and memory. Wolseley left soon after. He had achieved his objective, reached the capital, forced the Ashanti to retreat, and struck at the heart of their authority. A peace treaty was signed, under duress. The Ashanti agreed to pay an indemnity, open trade routes, and renounce claims over coastal territories. But it was a shallow peace. No Ashanti king signed the treaty. The British had spoken, but the soul of the empire had not replied. And as the columns withdrew back through the forest, back across the swollen rivers, the Ashanti began to return, to rebuild, to remember. Imagine now the first families walking again through the smoldering streets, children picking through ash for familiar shapes, elders murmuring prayers at the sight of lost shrines, and beneath it all, the steady certainty that the golden stool still remained, and that no empire built upon forest clay could be truly erased. In Britain, Wellesley was celebrated. The campaign was deemed a success, clean, decisive, professional. Medals were awarded, speeches made, reports filed and bound in dark green leather. But few in London spoke of the empty city, of the silence, of the lingering, unanswered drums that echoed just beyond the trees. The Ashanti had not been broken. They had only been pushed back into the waiting arms of the forest. And the war, though technically concluded, had not ended. It had only changed shape. In time, the British would attempt to govern the region, to bring order, to civilize. But the Ashanti would continue quietly, patiently, as always, watching, waiting, holding the rhythm of their history, even as the wind carried away its ashes. The British did not linger in Kumasi. They never meant to. Sir Garnet Wolseley's campaign had been calculated for speed, a swift strike into the heart of the Ashanti Empire, followed by an equally swift withdrawal. His orders were not to occupy, but to punish, to humiliate the Ashanti into submission, to strip them of the aura of invincibility they had quietly held for generations. And so, once the palace had been burned, and the Union Jack raised briefly over the clay compounds, the order was given. They would march back. The return journey, though free of enemy resistance, was no victory parade. The air was thick with the scent of damp ash and rotting foliage. Fires still smoldered behind them as they left the blackened bones of the palace wood turned to charcoal. Rafters collapsed. Shrines once daubed in sacred chalk, now reduced to silence and soot. The destruction of Kumasi was not complete in the physical sense. Many buildings remained. The city, built low and wide, could not be razed in a single day. But the palace symbol, sanctuary, and center was reduced to smoke. The act was meant to send a message. It did, but not the one the British imagined. For the Ashanti, the retreat of the British was not a conclusion. It was a sign. A sign that the foreigners, even at their strongest, had not stayed. That they had not claimed Kumasi, nor understood it. That they had come to conquer, but could not remain. As the British columns wound their way back through the dense interior, the forest closed again behind them, vines creeping over trampled underbrush, branches arching silently over the paths. The jungle is slow to forget. So too are the Ashanti. The march south was grueling. Though they were no longer burdened by confrontation, the soldiers bore a different kind of weight: fatigue, illness, and a growing awareness of how narrow their victory had been. Rain fell again, mud-soaked boots. Insects returned with ceaseless buzzing. Porters collapsed from exhaustion. Equipment was abandoned along the trails. At night, the flicker of campfires burned low, not in celebration, but in survival. Some men never reached the coast. Disease, that constant companion of tropical campaigns, took its toll. The hospitals at Cape Coast Castle, already overcrowded, filled beyond capacity. Surgeons worked quietly beneath flickering lanterns. There were no great speeches, no triumphal processions. Only rows of cots, the rasp of fevered breath, and the soft clink of tin cups. Meanwhile, Wolseley wrote his reports. He praised his men. He emphasized the success of the march. He highlighted the treaty signed under duress, but binding in British eyes. In London, the narrative took shape. The Ashanti, long portrayed as defiant and distant, had been tamed. The capital had been taken, the empire humbled. But the reality was not so clean. The Ashanti had never formally surrendered. Their king, Kofi Karakari, had not bowed. The golden stool, the embodiment of Ashanti sovereignty, had remained hidden, untouched, unseen. The British had walked into the heart of a kingdom and lit a fire, but they had not claimed its soul. In Kumasi, the people returned. The fire-blackened timbers were pulled down and burned again, this time with purpose. New compounds were raised. Ash was swept from courtyards. The rituals of rebuilding began not loudly, not in haste, but in the slow, steady rhythm that defined Ashanti life. Imagine an elder woman smoothing clay onto a new wall, her hands practiced, patient. A boy carrying water from the nearby stream. A priest whispering a prayer over a restored shrine. The smoke of incense curling into the humid air. The rhythm returned. It always did, but not unchanged. The memory of destruction lingered. The loss of treasures, the violation of sacred spaces, the broken stillness of the palace grounds, these things remained. Not as grief, exactly, but as resolve. The British had shown their strength. The Ashanti had felt it. And now they watched for its return. Back on the coast, the forts hummed with activity. British officials spoke of protectorates and reorganization. They believed the Ashanti, having suffered such a blow, would fall into line. They calculated tribute. They outlined trade routes. They drafted new maps, but the forest knew better. And so did Kumasi. The Ashanti Empire was not defeated. It had endured. Bruised, yes. Changed, certainly, but not erased. And the very act of retreat, the British decision to burn and leave, told the Ashanti something that no treaty could, that the kingdom still held power. That despite fire and musket and maps drawn in London, the forest could not be ruled from the coast or from abroad. The War of 1873 to 74 had ended, officially, but it had left behind more than ash and treaties. It had left a quiet defiance, one that smoldered beneath the rebuilt rooftops of Kumasi, one that waited, not for revenge, but for restoration. In war, there is often a tallying of land claimed, treaties signed, reputation secured. Numbers appear in ledgers. Maps are redrawn. Officials declare victories. But beneath all that, far from the noise of politics and print, there is a quieter reckoning. What truly was gained from the Third Anglo-Ashanti War? To the British, the answer was perhaps clear. The war had been short, and by imperial standards, efficient. The capital of a once feared kingdom had been reached and symbolically destroyed. A treaty had been signed under British terms. Territories once claimed by the Ashanti were now placed formally under British protection. Trade routes were opened, indemnities promised. For Parliament and the British press, it was presented as a triumph. Sir Garnet Wolseley returned home to accolades and promotion. The campaign was cited as a model of swift and effective colonial action. The Ashanti, so long portrayed as a threat to British commercial ambitions along the Gold Coast, had been chastised, and the balance of power in the region had been recalibrated. But even as the British celebrated, there was a quiet undercurrent of unease, because the Ashanti had not vanished. Their kingdom still stood, their people had returned. Their leaders had not surrendered, not fully, and the soul of their nation, the Golden Stool, remained untaken, its location still unknown to every British official. In Kumasi, what was lost had weight. Homes burned, shrines desecrated, artifacts looted, and yet there was something even heavier, the deep spiritual wound of foreign occupation, however brief. It was not the soldiers' boots that lingered, but the memory of their presence in the palace sacred ground, walked upon by outsiders. Yet even that did not break the Ashanti. If anything, it reaffirmed what they already knew. Empires could march through the forest. They could fire cannons and sign papers. But they could not take memory. They could not command the loyalty of spirits. And they could not understand the kind of strength that grows not from domination, but from return. Still, not all was unchanged. The war had exposed vulnerabilities in the Ashanti system, fractures in the Confederacy, tensions among regional chiefs, and the limits of their military capacity in the face of modern European firepower. Though they had endured, they had not won. Their influence over coastal peoples was diminished. Their reach constrained. A new pattern had emerged. The Ashanti remained strong in culture, spirit, and central governance, but their days of direct regional dominance had waned. The smaller tribes along the coast now leaned more openly toward British protection. Tribute that once flowed to Kumasi began to slow, then stop entirely. And so the Ashanti turned inward. There was rebuilding to be done, not just of walls and compounds, but of trust, of structure, of strategy. The court of the Asanihin, still sacred, became more focused on spiritual and cultural preservation. The balance between tradition and survival grew ever more delicate. Meanwhile, on the coast, British expansion quickened. New fortifications were constructed. Missionaries arrived in greater numbers, building schools, churches, and clinics. British civil servants began drafting laws. Their influence moved, not with armies now, but with ink and scripture, ledger and sermon. The Ashanti, watching, adjusted. Some among them embraced parts of the new order, sending sons to mission schools, trading with new currencies, learning English. Others resisted, quietly but consistently. The sacred rites continued. The elders still taught in the old ways. Drums still carried messages across the trees. The years following the war were not marked by battles. But they were not peaceful either. They were years of recalibration. Imagine for a moment a village just beyond Kumasi. Smoke from cooking fires curls above thatched roofs. A child runs across the courtyard, laughing, unaware of the scars the kingdom still bears. Elders sit in the shade, speaking softly of spirits and ancestors. A storyteller, voice low and rhythmic, recounts the march of the white men, how they came with guns and torches, how they took, then left, and how the forest always watching remains. In this way, the Ashanti held their history, not in books, not in archives, but in breath, in song, in the steady, enduring repetition of life. The British believed they had gained control, and to a degree they had. But true control of the heart, of the soul, of the memory of a people is not so easily taken. And so, even as British officials claimed victory in their reports, the deeper truth settled into the forest floor. The war had changed things, but it had not ended the story. That story would continue, shaped by new pressures, new kings, and eventually, a final confrontation still decades away. But that, dear listener, is still to come. For now, let the fires die down in your mind. Let the blackened walls of Kumasi fade back into the quiet green of the trees. Let the forest return to stillness. The march is over, but the memory walks on. Time passed. Years turned over like leaves in the forest wind. The ashes of Kumasi's destruction faded slowly into the clay, and with them, the immediate memory of fire gave way to quieter echoes, the sound of rebuilding, the rhythm of daily life, the endurance of ritual. And into this long moment of restoration, a new figure emerged. His name was Prempa. He was not born into peace. His early years unfolded in the shadow of British occupation, in a kingdom still nursing its pride. He grew up in a Kumasi that was both deeply familiar and subtly changed, its streets restored, its houses rebuilt, but its reach newly shortened. The old tributaries no longer flowed freely. Coastal authority had slipped beyond the empire's grasp. Yet Kumasi still breathed. The sacred drums still beat at dusk. The elders still sat in quiet council. And the stool, the golden stool, still remained untouched, hidden, revered, waiting. Prempa was crowned Asanahin in 1888, a time when the Ashanti Empire stood at a crossroads. He was young barely in his 20s, but poised, steady, measured in speech, deliberate in ceremony. Those who observed him noted not only his intelligence, but his bearing. He carried himself not with flamboyance, but with quiet conviction. His reign would not be one of conquest, but of preservation. He understood the changing world. British influence had only grown stronger. Along the coast, the forts had become government seats. Roads had been cut into the forest. Telegraph wires hummed quietly overhead. Churches rose beside mosques, and schools run by missionaries taught the children of chiefs and merchants to read English scriptures. Some in Kumasi feared this shift. Others embraced it. Prempa walked a careful line. He welcomed knowledge. He encouraged diplomacy. He understood the usefulness of adapting when necessary. But he would not submit, not to the queen, not to the empire, and not to any demand that placed the Ashanti beneath another's rule. He wrote letters, many of them, calm, courteous communications addressed to British officials, both in the Gold Coast and in London. He expressed friendship. He offered alliances. But he always stopped short of accepting British protection. To accept such a status would be to abandon the very soul of the Ashanti state. And so he resisted, but with words, not guns. He sent emissaries to Cape Coast, to Lagos, even to Sierra Leone. He listened to reports from envoys, missionaries, travelers. He kept his council informed. He ruled with dignity, not bluster. But pressure was building. The British, increasingly ambitious, increasingly confident, grew frustrated with Premp's refusals. They saw his stance as obstinate, archaic, an impediment to their designs for a modern, civilized West Africa. To them, Premp's Ashanti was a relic. To Prempa, Britain's empire was a storm on the horizon. Still, he hoped for peace. Imagine the Asanahin seated in his royal courtyard, a wide, open space shaded by ancient trees. Before him, elders sit cross-legged on woven mats. Beyond the gate, the sounds of the marketplace drift on the breeze. Traders calling softly, a bell chiming from a cloth stall, the rhythmic slap of fufu being pounded in a kitchen mortar. The Asanahin listens. He weighs. He considers the balance of tradition and the demands of a changing world. And then he writes. In one letter, dated 1891, he addresses British authorities with great care. He speaks of friendship, of shared interests. But his final lines are clear. We are an independent people. Our ancestors were never ruled. The stool of the Ashanti shall not be held beneath another's shadow. These are not words of war. They are words of identity, of boundaries drawn not in ink or on maps, but in memory, spirit, and oath. Yet for the British, identity was not enough. In London, The mood had shifted. The late 19th century was the age of high empire. Africa, from Cairo to the Cape, was being partitioned and claimed. Maps were redrawn almost weekly. Words like civilization and commerce were used to mask ambition. And Ghana, the Gold Coast, was to be a firm piece in the colonial puzzle. Ashanti independence did not fit that puzzle. Still, Prempeh held. Years passed. The drums in Kumasi beat softly at dawn. The marketplaces swelled with trade. Children learned to write in both Twi and English. Farmers tilled yam fields just as they had for generations. Life continued. But always, beneath the surface, there was a sense of waiting. The British did not forget the Ashanti. And the Ashanti did not forget the flames. By the mid-1890s, the pressure became unbearable. The British began to refer to Prempeh not as an ally, but as a defiant subordinate. They demanded the Ashanti accept protectorate status. Prempeh refused, again and again, in letters so calm they were sometimes mistaken for capitulation. But they were not. They were something far stronger. They were his line in the earth. And so, the British made their decision. In 1896, they would return, not with fire and battle, but with ceremony and precision. They would march into Kumasi again. And this time, they would take the king. The drums did not beat that morning. When the British entered Kumasi in 1896, there was no resistance, no battle lines, no barricades. The gates were not barred, the warriors did not assemble. The city, full of memory, waited in silence. Asanahin Prempeh, I stood in his palace, clothed in the rich symbolic fabric of his ancestors. He did not flee. He did not hide. He received the British as a sovereign would come, composed, his face betraying neither fear nor anger. But behind his stillness, a deep wound was forming. The British had come this time, not as soldiers of conquest, but as administrators of empire. They did not burn. They did not destroy. Their arrival was quiet, controlled, but no less devastating. In their hands, they held no sword-only papers. Orders, declarations, a statement from the crown. The Ashanti Empire, they now proclaimed, would become a protectorate of the British Empire. Not a colony yet but subject to British authority. Its foreign policy would be controlled. Its independence, though not erased on paper, would be reduced in every practical sense. And to seal this new arrangement, they would remove the king. Prempeh had known this was likely. His envoys had warned him. Letters from the coast grew sharper. Visitors from Accra spoke in clipped tones. And the soldiers, though small in number, had not marched for nothing. Still, he did not fight. He understood something deeper. That open resistance, in that moment, would mean ruin, not only for himself, but for his people. And so, he submitted not with words, but with dignity. On January 20th, 1896, Prempeh was arrested. He walked forward without chains, his head high, surrounded by elders and chiefs. Some wept, others stood in silence. A few, watching from rooftops and shaded doorways, turned away, unable to bear the sight. The British offered no violence. They did not need to. The message was clear. The king was leaving Kumasi not in disgrace, but in removal, as a symbol of submission, as a mark of British authority. He was taken to Cape Coast, then to Sierra Leone, and finally to the Seychellen Island, thousands of miles from the red soil of his homeland. There, in exile, he would remain for over 2 decades. Kumasi mourned quietly. There were no public outcries, no revolts, only a deepening stillness. The palace compound, now emptied of its ruler, became a space of memory. The rituals continued modified, redirected. The elders gathered. The priests whispered their invocations in the darkened corners of shrines. But something had changed. The Ashanti were now governed by resident British officials appointed to oversee administration. They lived in compounds near the palace, issued directives, signed papers. They did not understand the full weight of the golden stool, nor the rhythm of the calendar, marked not by months, but by festivals and seasons of harvest. Still, they governed. British flags flew in government offices. British law was introduced in stages. Ashanti courts were revised. Schools expanded teaching not only reading and arithmetic, but loyalty to the crown. The protectorate was, in many ways, a compromise. It allowed the Ashanti to retain much of their internal structure. Chiefs remained. The councils still met. Taxes were collected by local authorities. The British, though present, moved cautiously. They understood, on some level, that their position in the interior was not yet secure. But among the Ashanti, pride endured. The people had not been conquered in battle. Their king had not bowed. The golden stool, still hidden, still sacred, remained untouched. To the British, the protectorate was a legal arrangement. To the Ashanti, it was a temporary affliction. Even in Premp's absence, the soul of the empire pulsed quietly beneath the clay. His letters from exile were steady. He wrote of the climate, of the birds, of his memories of Kumasi. He addressed British officials with courtesy, but always reminded them that his people had never asked for protection, only for respect. Back in Kumasi, young boys were trained in new ways, learning to read English, to write reports, to recite colonial dates. But at home, they heard the old stories still, of Osei Tutu, of the sacred lake, of the birth of the stool from the sky, of how the British had come and left and come again. And always the forest stood. The trees did not speak, but they remembered. Imagine now a family gathered near dusk. The fire burns low. A bowl of fufu is passed from hand to hand. An elder, voice soft, recounts the story of the king who left, not in chains, but with the pride of all his ancestors behind him. Children listen with wide eyes. Outside, the insects hum in the warm air. The protectorate held for a time. But the heart of the Ashanti was not within treaties, nor in foreign offices. It lived in the silences, in the soil, in the empty stool that no foreigner could sit upon. And soon, the British would challenge even that. They would ask for the stool, and the forest would answer. There are symbols, and then there are souls. For the Ashanti, the golden stool, the Sika Dua Kofi, was never merely a symbol. It was not a throne. It was not a relic. It was and remains the very embodiment of the nation's spirit, its people, its ancestors, its kings, living and unborn. It was never sat upon, not even by the Asanahin. It was housed in sacred places, seen only during specific rites, carried with reverence on the shoulders of trusted bearers. Rituals surrounded it. Oaths were sworn upon its presence. Its gold surface gleamed not as treasure, but as testament. And so, when the British asked for it, they did not realize what they were asking. The year was 1900. 4 years had passed since the exile of Prempa I. The Ashanti were now governed under formal British rule. A resident named Frederick Hodson had taken the place once held by the Asanahin, though only in title, never in truth. Hodson, like many of his contemporaries, was confident in the expanding authority of empire. His duty, he believed, was to consolidate control, to bring British order to Ashanti custom, to finish what previous campaigns had begun. And so, in March of that year, he delivered a speech. It was not shouted, it was not violent, but it struck harder than any cannon. He stood in the open air of Kumasi, before chiefs and elders summoned under polite but firm command. His words, translated as he spoke, were sharp. Where is the golden stool? Why am I not sitting on it now? I am the representative of the Queen. The Queen is the ruler of Ashanti. The stool must be brought to me. A silence followed. It was not confusion. It was the sound of a line being crossed. The Ashanti did not answer him with words. Not then, not there. They simply left. And within days, the quiet forest once more became a vessel for resistance. What followed was not a traditional war. It was a siege, a rising, a subtle but unwavering refusal. Ye Asantewa, the queen mother of Ejisu, stepped forward not as a figurehead, but as a leader. She gathered warriors. She invoked ancestral memory. She reminded the people of who they were, of what the stool meant, of what must never be allowed. And the Ashanti rose. British officers, sensing danger, withdrew to the fort in Kumasi. The city became a quiet battlefield, not one of cannons and charges, but of watchful tension, of ambush and strategy. The fort, a low stone building with thick walls, became their refuge. Ashanti warriors surrounded it. They did not rush. They did not shout. They waited. And in the waiting, power shifted. Imagine now the British inside supplies growing thin, messages sent by runners through uncertain paths, the heat building inside those stone walls. Outside, the Ashanti moved in shadows, blocking exits, watching movements, cutting lines of retreat. For weeks, the fort was under siege, not by a formal army, but by a people who refused to let their soul be claimed. Reinforcements were eventually dispatched from the coast, a slow and difficult journey through the wet forest. By July, the siege was lifted. Kumasi was reoccupied, but the stool was never found. It had been hidden, protected, not buried, but placed in safekeeping by those who understood its weight. British soldiers searched. They questioned elders. They scoured shrines. But the stool had vanished from sight, not by magic, but by memory. It would not be seen by outsiders. It would not be sat upon. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The British withdrew the demand. Their officials, sensing the danger of continued conflict, relented. A new political arrangement was drafted. Ashanti chiefs were allowed limited self-rule under colonial oversight. But the cost was not small. Ya Asantewa, leader of the resistance, was captured and exiled. She, like Prempe before her, was sent across the sea to Seychelles. She never returned. And yet, her spirit remained. In whispered stories, in the songs of market women, in the careful reverence of Ashanti priests, her name endured. She had risen, not as a warrior queen in armor, but as a guardian of identity. Her stand was not for land or coin, but for soul. The golden stool remained safe, and that was victory enough. Back in London, the incident was reported in subdued tones. There was no triumph, no grand parade, only quiet acknowledgement of a challenge endured and overcome. But among the Ashanti, the memory lived stronger. A woman had defended their very essence. The forest had spoken, and once again, it had not surrendered. Imagine now the stool resting in a dark, quiet room. The air is still. A single beam of light strikes the gold surface, reflecting soft warmth. It is not touched. It is not moved. It simply remains, as it always has, as it always will. A kingdom may bend, a city may burn, but the spirit can still endure. The forest had spoken, but the empire would not retreat. After the Golden Stool incident of 1900, the final page of Ashanti independence was quietly, methodically turned. There would be no more sieges, no more letters to London, no more emissaries moving through the deep green canopy bearing gold dust and grievances. The resistance had spoken clearly, defiantly. And though the stool had been preserved, the Ashanti's political autonomy was not. In 1901, just 1 year after the uprising led by Ya Asantewa, the British declared the Ashanti territories a crown colony. The language was clinical, administrative. It appeared in papers and proclamations. Ashanti is hereby annexed to the British Crown and shall be governed as a territory under the direct authority of Her Majesty's government. And with those words, over 2 centuries of organized Ashanti sovereignty of kings and queen mothers, of sacred oaths, of measured diplomacy, and fierce independence was reduced to lines on colonial maps. There was no great battle to mark this end, no moment of theatrical surrender. The Ashanti, by then, were tired. Their leaders were in exile. Their warriors, though willing, were fragmented. The forest could shelter them no longer from the tide of imperial control. But even in defeat, there was something else: dignity and silence, the kind that holds generations within it. The final subjugation of the Ashanti was not about conquest in the traditional sense. There were no mass executions, no obliteration of cultural memory. Instead, there was erosion, a slow, methodical reshaping of life. British residents now occupied the halls once used for royal deliberation. They introduced new taxes, reorganized the justice system, built roads and railways ostensibly to develop the region, but primarily to extract resources and extend authority. English became the language of instruction in schools. Chiefs, once chosen by lineage and spiritual mandate, were now vetted and approved by colonial administrators. The sacred days, the festivals, the great durbars of ash and gold were now ceremonies attended by outsiders, not as participants, but as curious observers. Still, the golden stool remained untouched, and that mattered. Imagine now a child born in Kumasi in 1902. He does not remember Prempeh's exile or Ya Asantewaa siege. He grows up hearing stories of both quietly, around the hearth at night. He walks past the rebuilt palace. He watches British officials in starched white uniforms enter buildings that once belonged to his ancestors. And yet, he also sees the stool. He hears the drums at festival time. He learns not only from the schoolteacher, but from the village elders. The subjugation of the Ashanti was real, and it was final in terms of political autonomy, but cultural defeat was never achieved. In 1924, after 28 years of exile, Prempeh I was finally allowed to return. He was not restored as king in the political sense. The colony remained firmly under British control, but he was welcomed with reverence. The people lined the roads. Drums beat once more across the hills. Cloths of gold and deep indigo were unfurled. His return was a homecoming not of empire, but of spirit. Prempeh did not resume his old title. He accepted the modified role of Kumisahin, a position of traditional, but not political, authority. Still, he sat in the palace once more. He walked again beneath the canopies of the sacred trees. He visited the stool, and the forest, older now, but still watchful, seemed to sigh. In the decades that followed, British rule remained, but its roots were shallow. World wars came and passed. The great colonial project began to weaken. The tides shifted again, this time not with guns, but with words, with movements, with the call for self-rule growing louder throughout West Africa. In 1957, Ghana became independent, the first sub-Saharan African nation to do so. The Ashanti, long thought conquered, folded seamlessly into this new chapter. They had not waited for it, exactly, but they had endured long enough to see it come. Their kingdom, once humbled by empire, now stood proudly as part of a modern nation. And yet, in Kumasi, beneath layers of clay and memory, the drumbeat remains unchanged. The stool is still guarded. The spirits still listened to. And the final subjugation, though complete on paper, never quite settled into the hearts of the people. For history, though it bends to empires, always remembers its roots. And in the red earth of Ashanti land, those roots run deep. The fires no longer burned. The war drums had long fallen silent. The Union Jack still flew, but now it fluttered beside market cloths and laundry lines, sharing the sky with smoke from cooking fires and the soft rustle of baobab leaves. This was post-war Kumasi. Not a city conquered, but a city reawakening slowly, deliberately, from a long and restless dream. It had been just over 2 decades since the flames of conquest licked the courtyards of the palace, and the final treaties pressed Ashanti autonomy beneath the heavy hand of the crown. And yet, Kumasi had not disappeared. It had not become a ghost. It had endured, and more than that, it had adapted. By the early 1920s, Kumasi had transformed into something rare, a city that carried the layered weight of imperial rule while still exhaling the quiet breath of an ancient kingdom. Its buildings were a mixture now colonial compounds in pale plaster, standing next to shrines made of red clay. Roads carved by engineers ran beside old footpaths worn by generations. Telegraph wires stretched through the trees. Above courtyards, where elders still met beneath the sky to settle disputes. Imagine it. A morning in Kumasi, perhaps in 1925. The sun filters through the mist, touching rooftops both tiled and thatched. Chickens scratch the ground beside polished boots. A British official, in crisp linen, walks briskly to his office. He passes a group of drummers rehearsing for a festival. Neither looks at the other with hostility, only acknowledgement, because by now, each understood the other's permanence. The people of Kumasi had not rejected the colonial presence, at least, not openly. Resistance had quieted, but pride had not. British laws were enforced, but always filtered through the memory of older customs. Colonial governors came and went, while families in Kumasi traced their lineage back centuries without interruption. The Ashanti identity had not been erased. It had been rerouted. Prempa I, though denied his full royal power, had returned from exile in 1924 to a reception not unlike a coronation. No crown was placed on his head, but the city crowned him all the same. Markets buzzed, songs were composed. Children, many of whom had never seen his face, were taught his name with reverence. He settled back into his palace rebuilt and quiet, and took on the role of Komasihin. A ceremonial chief, yes, but one with spiritual weight. He no longer ruled by law, but by memory. He walked the old paths. He presided over festivals. He received visitors who bowed not to his political office, but to something deeper, the history he represented. His presence was a reminder that time had bent, but not broken. And within Kumasi itself, the city grew. New institutions emerged. Schools where English and Shui were both taught. Clinics run by colonial doctors, but staffed by local nurses. Marketplaces where imported cloth sat beside hand-dyed adinkra. The people moved freely between two worlds, wearing Western shoes, but singing in ancestral harmonies, writing in Latin letters, but thinking in proverbs. This was the Ashanti resilience, not resistance through confrontation, but through continuity. Even under colonial administration, the Ashanti collective identity held its form. Festivals such as Akwesai Day, held every 6 weeks in the presence of the Golden Stool, continued without interruption. Chiefs, selected through matrilineal lines, were still installed according to sacred rites. The stool itself remained hidden, revealed only during the most profound moments. British officials knew not to interfere. Some understood, others merely avoided what they could not command. The city as architecture told the same story. A colonial government building with Doric columns might stand beside a shrine shaped like an ancient drum. A post office on a street named for a British general might be opposite a courtyard where oral historians recited lineages stretching back to Osei Tutu. Everything coexisted, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully. And all around it, the forest still held its place green, thick, humming with life. Roads now reached farther, yes. Traders arrived by lorry instead of caravan. But the old routes, shaded by towering silk cotton trees, still welcomed footsteps. The air still carried the scent of damp earth, kola nuts, and palm oil. Kumasi was not a city frozen in the past. It was a city that moved, carefully, consciously, across the surface of change. Ashanti youth were growing up in a world their grandparents would barely recognize educated in colonial schools, reading about European wars, listening to phonographs imported from Liverpool. Yet they also returned home to stories of ancestral heroes, of sacred rivers, of the day the golden stool descended from the sky. To be Ashanti was no longer about power. It was about presence, about remaining intact, even when surrounded by foreign language and law, about rising each day and still calling oneself by the names given before empires came. In this way, post-war Kumasi became something the British did not fully anticipate. It became a quiet contradiction, a colonial capital that never ceased to be the heart of an African kingdom, a place where couriers delivered government notices, and where ancestors still listened beneath the roots of trees, where British residents held office, and where chiefs still sat on stools carved from sacred wood, where order was imposed from London, but identity still flowed from the forest. This was the gift and the burden of survival, and the quiet strength of Kumasi lay not in how it defied the British, but in how it refused to forget itself. Empires, like all great constructions, are built not only with ambition, but with uncertainty. And when the dust settles, when the wars are over, the treaties signed, the territories claimed, there often follows a quieter moment, one of reflection, of reckoning. And so it was slowly, haltingly, with the British and the Ashanti. The early decades of the 20th century marked a shift in tone. Not a full reversal, and certainly not an apology, but a softening, a re-evaluation, a murmur in the halls of administration that something perhaps had been misunderstood, mishandled, misread. In part, it was generational. Many of the British officials who took their posts in Kumasi during the 1910s and 1920s were not veterans of the Ashanti campaigns. They had not marched through the forest. They had not watched the palace burn. They arrived in clean suits, with books and maps and good intentions, but without the weight of personal enmity. And when they met the people, when they walked the shaded courtyards of Kumasi, sat beneath the enormous trees where chiefs still convened, listened to the music of the language and the quiet dignity of ritual, they found something unexpected. They found continuity. They found culture. And they found, perhaps uncomfortably, that the people they governed had not been conquered in spirit. British journals of the time, private letters, official dispatches, even scholarly essays began to hint at admiration. Officials wrote of the elegance of Ashanti legal traditions, of the clarity and fairness of local adjudication, of the efficiency of market organization and the sophistication of the kinship system. Some spoke in almost reverent tones of the golden stool, though they had never seen it. Others remarked on the quiet power of the queen mothers, who selected kings and settled disputes with a presence that defied easy classification in European political terms. One administrator, posted briefly to Kumasi in the early 1920s, wrote in his journal, "There is a strength here that does not reside in armies. It is not a strength I fully understand, but I believe we may have mistaken stubbornness for wisdom and silence for consent." Such reflections were not widespread. Many still saw the Ashanti through the old imperial lens, strategic, exotic, to be managed rather than understood. But the tone had changed. Even in London, a faint awareness began to emerge. Histories written in the early years of the century still told the story of conquest, of British triumph, of bringing order to the Gold Coast. But among certain intellectual circles, new voices began to ask more careful questions. Why had the Ashanti resisted so fiercely? Why had the golden stool remained hidden? Why had Kumasi returned again and again after being destroyed? Some even traveled to Ghana to study, to document, to understand. Anthropologists, linguists, writers. A few British officials having spent years in Ashanti lands, returned home with stories, not of savagery, but of civilization, not of backwardness, but of depth. They spoke of proverbs, of lineages, of dance and ceremony, of the rhythm of history that still beat beneath the noise of modern governance. And slowly, the image of the Ashanti shifted. They were no longer merely a conquered people. They became, in some minds, a people of remarkable endurance. In Kumasi, the British still governed, but they did so more carefully, not because they feared revolt, though the memory of Ya Asantewa remained, but because they had come to understand that no amount of paper and proclamation could erase what was held in the hearts of the people. Respect, in its smallest forms, began to appear. Certain rituals were no longer interrupted. Certain shrines were left undisturbed. In official ceremonies, British residents began to bow not deeply, but noticeably to Ashanti chiefs. It was not restitution, it was not reversal, but it was something. A recognition, perhaps, that in seeking to dominate, the British had also missed an opportunity to learn, to listen, to appreciate the weight of a civilization older than many European nations. Regret, when it came, was rarely spoken. But in the quiet corners of letters, in the tone of memoirs written long after retirement, it emerged. A sense that conquest, though effective in its aims, had cost more than gold or manpower. It had cost understanding, and perhaps something of integrity. Imagine now a former resident, years later, seated in a London flat. Rain taps softly on the windows. He opens an old journal, its leather worn, its pages curled with age. Inside are notes from Kumasi meeting times, trade figures, reports. But there, between them, a single sketch, the outline of a stool, not labeled, just drawn carefully. And the man, older now, wonders what it meant, what he missed, what he might have asked, had he known how. In Kumasi, the past remained close. Ashanti elders continued to teach the young. The stool was not shown, but always spoken of. The memory of Prempa, of Iya Santewa, of the wars, of the treaties, they were kept alive in story and song. The British had changed the Ashanti, but the Ashanti had also changed the British, even if the empire didn't always admit it. There is a rhythm to memory, not loud, not linear, but persistent. It hums beneath the flow of days, beneath the chatter of markets and the pages of school books. It pulses softly, like a drum too far to hear yet still felt in the chest. In Ashanti, that rhythm never stopped, even through the wars, even through exile, even through protectorate and colony. Even now, it endures. What is it that lasts after empire? After flames and flags, treaties and translations? It is not the buildings. Many of them are gone. The forts remain, some turned into museums, others left to the wind. The palace of Kumasi has been rebuilt, not once but many times, its clay replaced, its frame adjusted. But the soul of it, its purpose, never changed. Nor is it the papers. Treaties crumble. Decrees are forgotten. Even the maps fade, their lines smudged by new boundaries, new nations. What endures is something quieter, more constant, in the names. In the steps of the Ottawa dance, performed beneath canopies of silk cloth at festivals like Aquaside. In the language used still spoken in court, in kitchens, in classrooms. In the kente cloth, still woven on narrow looms with patterns whose meanings are known by heart. In the carved stools passed down from one generation to the next, not the golden stool, which remains sacred and unseen, but family stools. Memory made tangible in wood. What endures is the story of a people who resisted not always with spears, but with structure. Not always with arms, but with silence. Not always in war, but in the daily act of remembering who they were. Imagine now a festival day in modern Kumasi. The square is filled. Brass bands play beside talking drums. The scent of smoked fish and red palm stew rises into the air. Chiefs arrive beneath parasols embroidered with symbols older than the colonies. Each takes their place, not by accident, but by lineage, by oath, by quiet ancestral approval. And then, the stool. Not the stool, but a stool nonetheless, carved in homage, carried with care, set down in the proper place. A child watches from the crowd, her eyes wide. She knows some of the story. She has heard it sung, of Aze Tutu, of Prempa, of the march, of the fire, of the exile, of the return. She may not know all the names or all the dates, but she knows the feel of it, the rhythm. She claps with the drums. Elsewhere, in a nearby home, an elder sits beneath the shade of a mango tree. His hands rest on his lap. His voice is quiet. He is telling his grandson of the day the British came for the stool. The boy listens, not to be tested, but to remember. And across the city, in classrooms built long after independence, the curriculum teaches colonial history, the wars, the treaties, but it also teaches Ashanti history as its own thing, not a footnote, not a casualty, a thread that runs alongside all others. What endures, not triumph, not grievance, but balance. The balance of holding both the loss and the pride, of knowing what was taken and what could never be, of watching foreign flags rise and fall, and still polishing the shrine each morning. As the sun lifts gently over the eastern forest, the British left Ghana in 1957. The empire receded, but the Ashanti remained. Their empire is no longer one of territory. It is of meaning. It is in the architecture of thought, in ritual, in memory, in the golden weight of continuity. What endures? You might not see it, you might not touch it, but it is there. In the way a woman ties her cloth, in the proverb whispered before a decision, in the silence before a drumbeat, in the unseen stool. Now we return to the present, to this moment, to you, lying in bed or resting in your chair, perhaps wrapped in a soft blanket. The low sounds of this story still curling through the air, like the distant echo of a drum across the forest canopy. You've wandered far tonight, from the dusty red paths of Kumasi to the flickering lanterns of British forts, from the determined steps of Prempa I to the silence of the sacred stool, from the smoke of war to the slow, persistent heartbeat of survival. And now, here you are. And here, too, are the Ashanti, not in the past, but in the now, still present, still vibrant, still rooted. Ashanti is no longer an empire of dominion. It is no longer locked in battle with a distant queen. It is part of a modern Ghana, one of Africa's most stable democracies, a nation of writers and artists, of engineers and elders, of children who learn about the world and their ancestors in the same breath. And Kumasi? Still the beating heart, still a place of market cries and motorcycle engines, of gospel hymns and funeral drums, of mango trees leaning over schoolyards and sacred stools resting in darkened rooms, unseen but never forgotten. Perhaps if you visited today, you'd find yourself walking through the open-air Kajisha market, where rows of sellers call out in a musical mix of Twi and English. Laughter rises in waves, and the air is full of roasted corn, fresh tomatoes, shea butter, and rain-soaked clay. And just beyond the crowd, you might glimpse the Manhia Palace, where the Essanahin still holds court, not as a king of land, but as a guardian of tradition, a steward of history, a living link to centuries of resilience. The British are no longer there. Their flags are folded, their titles gone, but the Ashanti, they remain. Their songs continue. Their children still dance the Ottawa. Their elders still speak in proverbs that stretch backward and forward, like vines growing from the soil of time itself. And so, As you drift further now, your eyes growing heavy, your thoughts slowing like the sun setting over the green ridges of the Ashanti uplands, let the story settle gently into you. Let the noise of empires fall away. Let only the steady rhythm remain. The rhythm of a people who walked through fire, who held their silence when it mattered, who hid their soul in gold and wood, not to hoard it, but to protect it, and who passed it on, generation by generation, all the way to now, to this moment, to you, listening in the hush of night, to the quiet strength that still lives in memory, to the golden stool still unbroken, still untouched, still waiting, still there